historians would call vertical integration. He's basically beginning not only to buy ironworks, but he starts to buy coal mines and iron mines. He begins to buy his competitors, and he's building a big company that has control of its supply chain from raw product to its end product. And that's kind of unusual in this part of the 19th century. He's also very strategically located here in Phoenixville. You've got the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. You've got the Schuylkill Canal, which are important supply transportation routes for him. And he gets into this just about the right time because the railroad boom creates a huge demand for rails. And Phoenixville, after being famous for nails and spikes, becomes famous for iron rails and does quite well for itself. The first rails that came to the United States for railroads were actually produced in England, and that was in the late 1820s. And it took about another 10 to 15 years for American manufacturers in the iron business to figure out how to roll these rails. And they began rolling iron rails. There were lots of different kinds of shapes of rails. Eventually, it standardized on the kind of shape we know today. Phoenixville was right in the mix of that, coming up with ways to roll wrought iron rails. And they became quite good at it. And the Reeves in particular were known for developing this process of straightening the rails. This photograph taken of this process as it existed in the 1920s is pretty much what was done here in the 1840s. The description here about how basically they were putting these rails through presses and then straightening them out by pressing down, setting a block between the press and the rail, and it was called gagging or cold straightening the rails. The rails had already been rolled, and they would straighten them out. And this was an important process developed here in Phoenixville. And from that experience of rolling rails, they began to roll other kinds of shapes. And you begin to see in the 1850s here in Phoenixville, they began to roll I-beams. And they began to roll channels and buckle plates and T-bars and some very odd shapes, some of which I don't have an idea what they were used for. But this is an example from the 1870s of all these shapes that they had started rolling here in Phoenixville on wrought iron. And John Fritz, who was one of the foremen at Phoenix, in the Phoenix Iron Company, developed this important innovation in rolling. This is a 3-high roll, and the iron billets would be passed through the roll, start forming an I shape, and then back through, back and forth, so you got the shape you wanted. And prior to this time, the rolls had always been too high. So Phoenixville had this innovation. And at too high, you had to pass it through once and then reverse the rolls to pass it back. But in this instance, you just kind of went back and forth and back and forth. Very efficient. The first hydraulic dies for pressing out I-bars were here at Phoenixville, developed in the late 1850s. Here you can see the presses. They're putting in the bars and then pressing out the loop-shaped eyes. And these are really important components in bridges.
Patrick, maybe you can answer a question. When we first started to restore the foundry, we found that shape above our head, and then the long one up here and the long one up there. Did they come later, those patterns? Well, I always tell the kids that they're for the railroad tracks.
They are. Yeah. Here in the foundry, they would have cast any kind of shape they needed for what they were doing. And the bridges had certain kinds of shapes. Railroad component parts had certain kinds of shapes. I think most of what you probably found here in the foundry after it was closed were patterns that were in the foundry because they've been used within a fairly recent period.
Okay.
as opposed to.
So they would still be using that kind of a pattern
Oh, yes.
in the 20th century?
Yeah, they still use wood pattern. The wood pattern makers were among the most skilled individuals at the foundry. And most foundries had lofts where they stored thousands and thousands of patterns. So I'm sure there was a pattern loft here on the site somewhere.
There's a separate building next door to that.
Okay.
It's in the dining room.
Oh, it is? Okay. So, yeah, feel free to chime in and interrupt me.
Well, I just thought he's talking about the railroads,
Yeah.
and there's one right above his head.
Yeah. I defer to your knowledge of this site and lots of the history here in Phoenixville. You may know more about some of this than I do. My perspective is sort of coming at it from having studied all these bridges all of these years and then taken a look through the Phoenix Company records, which are in Hagley. And so if you've never been down to Hagley to look at the original company records, there are boxes and boxes and boxes and ledgers and ledgers and ledgers full of information. Some of it's very hard to decode, but there's a lot of information there. You could even just go down and if you wanted to look at Samuel Reed's original patent. It's down there. It's got the original sealing wax with it and the ribbon, that came from the patent office. When you're interested in these kinds of things, to get a chance to go see that it's real, feel it. It's a great thing to do. So
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Thanks to Patrick, our structural engineer for the wheel, and myself, we went down there, and Patrick led us through the maze of archival records at the Hagley. It was fascinating, and there were orders for bridges in Brazil and Mexico and Guatemala. I just couldn't believe it. Thank you. It was awesome.
And this is of course they did riveting here too. And this is sort of the process of riveting as it would have occurred here in the years around the Civil War. And you can see a riveting crew here at the brazier. They're heating up the rivets to red hot. The rivets placed through a pre-drilled hole, held there. The riveter swings the hammer onto the cup, which forms the rounded head that hasn't been, that's formed as it's hammered, and the dolly bar in the back, sort of a bucking bar, it's sometimes called. They lean into it to hold that rivet really tightly in place. It's a real skill to do this right and do it very fast. So fast that you can't believe that anybody could work that fast, but they would work very, very quickly. At least for some of the period here at Phoenixville, this was not wage work, this was piecework. You were required to do so much a day. The faster you got it done, the faster you got to go home. Or if they had a big order in here, you can make a lot of extra money working very, very quickly. The riveters there were many skilled jobs here at Phoenixville, and this was one of the important ones. Which brings me to this sort of topic of management labor. And the main thing I want you to bring from this is that after talking about all these technological innovations that were happening here, you get the sense that the Reeves, as the owners of the family, the leaders, the directing forces here, were very interested in new technologies, in improving technology here at Phoenixville, at doing things faster, better, bigger than other companies. There were 1,200 employees here by 1860. 1,200 is a huge company for 1860. I haven't gone to study it, but I don't know of many other companies in the United States at that period of time that would have employed that many people. It's really an amazing number of people. There may have been some railroads that could come close to rivaling Phoenixville with the number of employees, but I can't think of other firms. It was a big, important iron company, very innovative, and particularly in developing new technologies. As I said, I just sort of throw this in here. Phoenix actually had a pretty good reputation amongst iron companies for how it treated its workers, but things always didn't go well. And one of the things we know about this period of time is when you introduce new technologies, try to make things bigger, try to make the work go faster, you very often run into problems with workers who are very traditional in their approaches to how much work they should be asked to be done today, how much control there should be over their work. And these machines that are being introduced here are in their way forcing workers who work with them to work to the pace of the machine rather than to the hand pace that they were used to doing their work. And there were problems here. This is a notice, there's a strike in 1882. Phoenix Iron Company telling them, you know, if you come back to work, we'll treat you well, but if you don't come back to work, we're going to replace you right away. So this was going on. There were difficulties. It was not, by today's standard, a safe place to work. There was no OSHA. Lots of people got seriously hurt. Lots of workers did. The bridge building, too, was very dangerous. There are numerous examples of the bridges collapsing, workers dying during the erection of them. The Quebec Bridge being the most famous example, but there are lots of others as well. And it's really clear when you look through the records of the companies at Hagley that one of the reasons there are, you know, Phoenix Iron Company is actually several companies. And there's certainly a sense that they have separated these things out for problems of liability. Not so much worker compensation or workers' liability, but liability with their customers. Because if you're building a bridge for the railroad company and that bridge collapses because there's a flood, it knocks out the false work, which happened many times actually. As far as I can tell, it's happening maybe 8 or 9 times a year. And in a bad year, it wiped out all the bridge company's profits. But they didn't want that to spill over into the iron company. You know, so the iron company kept its own books, the bridge company kept its own books, the coal companies kept their own books, et cetera, et cetera.